It's 1 o'clock. I think we can get started. Welcome everybody. A pleasure to welcome back Yosef Lindell. It's been a little bit while, but it's always a pleasure. Always his courses are always very interesting, and we're just going to be I guess a relatively short 4-part series about the history of Jewish music and prayer. I think even is music kosher. Has an OU on it. If other or what depends on the hashkacha, depends who you ask. Okay, but really about Jewish prayer in the synagogue and beyond. Yossi Nadel, as you may have gathered, he's a lawyer living he lives in Kemp Mills, Silver Spring, but works in Washington, D.C. for the United States government as a lawyer. And one of the founders of Lair House, pop, it's very wonderful website with all kinds of, good intellectual, high-level learning. And it's a pleasure to welcome him back to Torah Motion. Bakasha, Yosef.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rabbi Kelman. I'm very happy to be back. It's always really a highlight of what I do to be able to give classes of Torah in motion to such a wonderful and enthusiastic audience that's so interested in learning Torah, particularly learning it in my be, putting up my own idiosyncratic way of teaching it. Everything I try to do for Torah in motion and all my classes is kind of a little off the beaten track. Maybe uh, it's a little bit too much maybe to cover all of Jewish music in 4 classes. So obviously this is going to be somewhat idiosyncratic in its presentation, and that I'm going to focus on certain things and focus less on other things. And as Rabbi Kahn pointed out, I'm particularly interested in the way that our davening interacts with music and the way our nusach tefillah and our chazanas and the way davening is accompanied and sort of how music plays into that, and also the big question of how we deal with non-Jewish influence in music, because as we're going to see, there really is music is so intertwined with the surrounding culture. There's really no way to get around that issue, and we're going to look at that from a halachic perspective and also from a historical perspective. Just slightly again by way of a little way of introduction. So where did I come to this topic to begin with? So I've always loved music. I actually come from a fairly musical family. My good family story that we have is my grandfather, who's actually still alive. He's 94 now. Um, he considered making a career as a musician, and he played in the Air Force band during the Korean War. And his friend there in the band was a man named John Williams. And John Williams ended up being a world famous film composer, possibly the most famous film composer of all time. Um, and I think my grandfather felt that John Williams was so good as a musician that he didn't have a chance of making it in the music world. He went on to become an electrical engineer. He did all sorts of interesting things, but and he continued to play music, but he didn't do that. My own musical talents are more modest. I never got beyond a beginner piano book, so I can sort of sound out a few things on the piano, but not so much beyond that. I sing a passable tenor, and I'm a decent chazan, and maybe you'll hear just a little bit of that in this class. I made it my business to study nusach carefully, though. And when I was in YU, and we're talking 2007, 2008, so it's a little while ago, I took some classes at the Bell School of Music, their cantorial school. And I've been a chazan for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, for on and off for a number of years also. So I do bring that background at least to that as well. Um, so just to give an outline of where the 4 classes are going, and then we'll get into it right after that. In this first class, I want to set the stage by talking about the origins of several different aspects of Jewish music. Uh, we'll start with music in the Beis Hamikdash, and about which you know actually very little, but also the halachic tradition about what do you do after the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, because there's a long halachic streak of not listening to music at all and that being prohibited. We'll also try to talk about where our ta'amim, where our trup, where the laning comes from, and also where the Nesachat Tefillah comes from. And then the second class, we're going to talk about the role of the Chazan throughout history and highlight areas where there's been controversy. In the third class, we'll dive into the historical and halachic question of non-Jewish influence on music by looking at a particular flashpoint in the Renaissance in Italy. And in the last class, we will talk a lot about the explosion of modern Jewish pop music. that's really taken over since the 1970s, and you hear at Jewish events and weddings, and you hear everywhere, and really made its way into shul too. And sort of what are some of the discussions around that, and how that can help us understand what Jewish music is and where Jewish music is going. And I think over all of this, the larger question is what makes music Jewish? And I hope that by the end of the class, we'll have some kind of tentative answer to that question, at least. Okay, so let's begin in the Beis Hamikdash. Now we know that music was a very important part of the service and the worship in the Beis Hamikdash, but we only have very small hints of what it was like. Let me take you through some of the sources on this, and I'll do that by sharing my source sheet. Okay, so hopefully everyone can see the source sheet. Um, and hold on. Okay, so we can see the source sheet here, and let's look at this part one over here, music in the temple. So we have a pasuk here in Amos. Amos was a prophet in the northern kingdom. Hashem here in this pasuk is speaking through Amos of his displeasure with the religious worship in the northern kingdom at the time. And he says, Ki im talu li olos min choseam lo eretzeh. If you bring me your burnt offerings, your grain offerings, I will not accept them. V'shalom miri'echem lo abit. And I will not heed the gifts of your fat offerings. Haser mi alei hamon shirecha. Spare me the sound of your hymns. V'zimras nivalecha lo eshma. And let me not hear the music of your lutes. And then we have the famous words, "Vayigel kamayim mishpat u'tzedakah kanachal yisan." But let justice well up like water, righteousness like an unfailing stream. So Hashem is saying over here through Amos that I don't want to hear your music when you bring the karbanos because I want you to be doing the right and ethical thing. However fancy you make your karbanos is not going to be good enough. But what do we see from this? What we do see is clearly when they were offering the karbanos, they are playing music. They are using musical instruments. They are singing. So we see that that was an important part of the service. If we move on here to source number 2, this is a description Divrei Hayamim in Chronicles of the dedication of the Beis Hamikdash, Shlomo's dedication of the first Beis Hamikdash. And what do we see over here? V'halavim hamishorim, that there were Levite singers. And you see some of the names. The Chulam, the Asaf, the Heman, the Dusun, Livneim, Lachehem, their sons, their brothers, Mulubashim, butz, dressed in fine linen. And what do they have? B'mitzaltayim, they have cymbals, Unavalim, harps, and chinaros, lyres, Omdim, Mizrach, Mizbeach. And they're standing to the east of the altar. And you see as the source goes on that they are praising Hashem with these instruments. So you see that music was an important part of this ceremony as well. In fact, scholars have cataloged 19 different musical instruments mentioned in Tanakh. Many of them are mentioned in Sefer Tehillim. We saw 4 of them above. We saw the cymbals, we saw the lyres, we saw the harps. We also, it says in that one, chatzotzros, later on in that source, so we see trumpets as well, so that's 4 right over there. So we see that indeed there was music in the Beis Hamikdash. Now, what did this music sound like? Well, this we really don't have a very good idea. If we look in Sefer Tehillim, we do get the sense that many of the Mizmorei Tehillim, many of the chapters of Tehillim were indeed meant to be sung. And Mizmor Shir alone, we often hear that at the beginning of a psalm, at the beginning of a parak of Tehillim, it says, it's a Mizmor Shir. It's some kind of song. Do we know what it's like? Not exactly. But there's some interesting superscriptions. So a superscription is like the introduction to a piece of Tehillim. It seems to talk about how you're supposed to do this piece of Tehillim. So let's look, for example, in source number 3, Tehillim Chaf Beis, 22. It says, Lam Netzeach al Hayalas HaShachar Mizmor LeDavid. This is some kind of instruction to how this is supposed to be performed. So Lam Netzeach might mean for the choir leader. Not completely clear, but there might be a direction for the choir leader. Then it says Al Hayalas HaShachar, on an Hayalas HaShachar, on the dough of the dawn, or something like that. Not clear exactly what that phrase means. But what is this talking about? Some people used to say, so this is some kind of musical instrument, but it doesn't really sound like a musical instrument. It's a really odd name for a musical instrument. More recently, the suggestion has been it's actually a musical style or even a tune. That there was some tune called Doe of the Dawn, popular at the time, or something like that, and this Mizmor Tehillim was supposed to be sung to that tune or in that style. If you look in source number 4, you see a similar thing with even more instructions in the superscription. This is Tehillim Nun Vav. It says Lam Natseach al Yonas Elam Rechokim LeDavid Michtam Bechozoso Plishtim Bagat. So what do we see here? We see all these different instructions. Lam Natseach, so potentially for the choir leader, Al Yonas Elam Rechokim, to this tune, possibly or style of Yonas Elam Rechokim, which I guess is the distant silent dove. Again, very, very mysterious. Li David. Okay, so this was presumably then either written by David or in the style that David wrote. Michtam. Oh, here's another word we don't really know what it means. Michtam, what is that? Is this it seems to be another instruction? Possibly this is an instrument. Some have suggested this is like some kind of bass or some kind of percussion. And then what we have at the end, Bechozosos Plishtim Bagas, that when the Plishtim captured Megas. So this is giving you the historical event of when this either psalm was written or the event that it's supposed to commemorate. So we see over here that we do have these instructions, these tantalizing instructions for maybe how the Tehillim was supposed to be sung, even though we don't have a strong idea of what exactly this was how exactly this was done. Okay, if we get to the Second Temple period, if we get to the Second Temple, oh, I guess I should also say that maybe some of you are wondering about the word Selah. That comes up a lot in Tehillim also. No one has any idea what Selah means, but some have said that that too may have been some kind of musical instruction. You could translate it forever. Some people do that, but it's interesting in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, it's translated as some kind of musical interlude. So it may be some kind of musical direction. It may be something else. People don't really know. Um, if we move on to the Second Temple period, we look at this Mishnah in Erechin. It gives a very detailed explanation for how exactly the music is done. And it says, Ein pochasim me'esim ve'achas tikiyos mikdash v'lo mosifin arbim shma. So no less than 21 blasts of the shofar, and no more than 48. Ein pochasim mishnei nevalim v'lo mosifin al shisha. No less than 2 harps, no more than 6. Ein pochasim mishnei chalilin, not less than 2 flutes, v'lo mosifin al shnei masar, not more than 12 flutes. V'shnei masar yom b'shana chalil makal lefnei mizbeach. And 12 days of the year the flute is played, and it gives the list of where those things are played, all the days. And it says at the second to last line, "V'lo hayamaka be'avuv shel nechoshes, ela be'avuv shel kaneh." And you don't play a pipe of bronze, but a pipe of reed, mipnei shekol ha'arev, because the tune is sweeter. V'lo hayamachlik ela be'avuv yechidi. And you only use a single pipe for the closing tube, mipnei shemachlik yaf, because it makes a pleasant sort of sound at the conclusion. So we see a very detailed explanation here for how music was supposed to be done in the Beis Hamikdash. I didn't give you the next couple Mishnahs later in Erechim, but it talks about the number of Levium. There's supposed to be no less than 12 Levium playing and singing either. And then in the Mishnah and Tamid, maybe some of you are familiar with this as well. When they brought we actually say this in our davening on Shabbos, when the Levium when the Kohanim brought the karbanos, the Levium would sing a Mizmor Tehillim, one Mizmor Tehillim for each day. There was a Shir Shel Yom, which we even say every day in our davening to commemorate what the Levium did. So definitely playing music, singing was an important part of what was going on in the Beis Hamikdash. Now there was a problem though, when we see this in the Mishnah and Yoma, and the problem is that part of the reason we lost this tradition is because it wasn't taught. The Mishnah says that these are various families that are mentioned for shame because they did something wrong. And if you look in the middle line there, it says Hugros ben Levi, Hugros from the tribe of Levi, Hayodea Perak Bashir. He knew a chapter concerning the song. Presumably, he knew the way that the Levium sang in the Beis Hamikdash, V'lo Ratzal Alamed, and he did not want to teach it. And perhaps this is part of the reason why this tradition did not continue, because it was not taught. And indeed, unfortunately, as we know, the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, and the music stopped. But there was no more karbanos, and there was no more music. And this seems to be the main place where, one of the main places, I guess, where ancient Jews, were playing music. And in fact, after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, Chazal came around, and Chazal, after in the end of the Second Temple period, and then beyond that, and they actually prohibited music. And they said because the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, we can't play music at all anymore. And this is from the Gemara in Gittin, source number 7. Shachalo lemar ukva. And they sent the following question to Mar Ukva. Zamar minal and asir. Where do we know that song is now forbidden? Sir date v'kastavlu. He scored a parchment and he wrote to them, Al tismach Yisrael gil ba'amim. Rejoice not, O Israel, to exaltation like the peoples. So fascinatingly enough, it seems that the prohibition on music post the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash has to do with the fact that this is something that the other nations do. But you, Israel, in your sorrow, in your sadness over the Beis Hamikdash, this is not something you can do anymore. You cannot be listening to music anymore. The Gemara then asks, we have a different pasuk that we could have used. Bishir lo yishtu yayin yemar shechar l'shosav. Do not drink wine with song. Strong drink is bitter to them who drink it. This is a pasuk from Yeshayahu, which would also indicate there's something bad about when you're drinking wine. When you might usually sing, no, you can't do that anymore. So the Gemara says, "Imahu." If we just use the pasuk in Yeshayahu, Hava min hayamili zamar damana of depuma shari kamash malan. Then I would think that that's only talking about vocal songs. But sorry, only talking about instrumental music. And actually, like the Steinsaltz helps you over here. It says that it's talking about, in particular, when it's talking about playing music while drinking wine. There, it's talking about playing music instrumentally. However, the Gemara says that actually all types of song are forbidden. It doesn't matter if you use musical instruments or even if it's just vocal. It's all prohibited, and that's why the other pasuk of Altis Mach Yisrael Gil Ba'amim is better, because that pasuk is not specific to instrumental music, but it would include even vocal music. So if we look just at the Gemara over here, what are we even doing nowadays? It would seem that music, whether we play musical instruments or whether we sing, is all forbidden after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. So the halachic authorities, post the Gemara, have to struggle with this and figure out, so what is going on? Exactly in what context is music prohibited, and what context is music permitted? And we're going to see a range, a very large range, actually, of views on this topic. So let's look for source number 8, and maybe the strictest source of all. And this is the Chuvas HaRambam. This is what the Rambam wrote in a Chuva, in a responsum. And he says, "She'etzem azer v'nigum kulam asur, music and song are all forbidden. Afilu ein omer le'am milim klal," like the Gemara says. Even if there's, he says even beyond that. Okay, sorry, not like the Gemara, even without words, he says. Kuvar bir hatalmud shein havdel ben shmias hazemer o nigun al mesarim, and the Gemara already said there's no difference whether you're playing it with strings, whether it's an instrumental, or shmas was below, even if there's no instrument. Anything that leads to the soul's pleasure and feeling is all prohibited. So the Rambam seems to be saying whether it's vocal music, whether it's instrumental music, it's all prohibited. Now, the Rambam does soften his position in the Mishnah Torah, and so he actually ends up saying that we can be a little less strict. And he says, if you look in source number 9, you shouldn't do it with musical instruments, and any type of instrument that makes music, you can't be joyous with it. And the reason you can't do this is because of the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. And even vocal music over wine is forbidden. So you can't go to the tavern and sing, but he seems to be saying now that actually, when it comes to vocal music, you don't have to be as strict, and you can prohibit it. You can permit it in certain contexts. So this is the Rambam, and the Rambam, as I said, is very strict. Rashi and Tosfos disagree. And you look in sources number 10 and 11. Already Rashi on the Gemara in Gittin, when the Gemara says Zamar, how we know that music is forbidden, he says Zamar, what does it mean? L'shor bebeis hamishtaos, singing in the tavern like at a party. So Rashi is already seriously limiting the prohibition to a certain context, and would say that in general, though, music outside of that context, even instrumental music, would not be forbidden. Tosfos in source number 11 explains why. And Tosfos says, Pirish B'Kuntris, if you look on the fourth word there, after the break, Rashi explained the shor beis mishtaos. It's just a problem of singing in the tavern. V'chein mashma, and this is seems to be so. Why? Because the the verse that they were contemplating using in the Gemara was about singing while wine was being served. So it would suggest that already the Gemara had this idea that maybe it was not forbidden in every context. But even more so, Tosfos brings in another Gemara, and Tosfos says with Perik Basra de Sota, in the last parak of the Gemara in Sota, Tanan Misha Batla Sanhedrin Batal Shir Bebeis Hamishtaos Shnemer Bashir Lo Yishtu Yain. The Gemara over there says when the Sanhedrin was nullified, meaning essentially when the base of Mikdash again was destroyed, they got rid of song from the taverns, and they bring that pasuk of in song with wine you shall not have song. So it seems over here already that if you want to harmonize these two sugyos, if you want to make the Gemara in Sota fit with the Gemara in Gittin, it would seem the Gemara in Sota is very clearly only prohibiting music in a social tavern-like context, and therefore that it would make sense that the Gemara in Gittin is saying the same thing, and that's generally Tosfos' methodology. When you have two conflicting Gemaras, you try to harmonize those two Gemaras rather than leaving it as a conflict. Rambam is more willing to do that. Tosfos is generally not willing to do that. And Tosfos continues, and he says that still maybe you should be machmir. V'roy lahachmir b'kiyotze dahu b'Yerushalmi, like in the case in Yerushalmi, to have a kaim v'damiach b'zamra, the one who gets up and goes to sleep with music, shemisanik b'yos. So that's just too happy. After the destruction of the base of Mikdash. V'shir shal mitzvah share kigom b'shas chopa she'osin l'smoach chasen v'kala. But he also says, important to note, if we're trying to be misameach, the groom and the bride at the time of a wedding, then it's okay to play instrumental music. Okay, so how do we paskin after we see all this? The Shulchan Aruch actually is very strict. The Shulchan Aruch, as he often does, he essentially quotes the Rambam in the Mishnah Torah, and he's prohibitive. He says you can do vocal music as long as not over wine, but you can't you can't do instrumental music. But the Ramah in source number 12 disagrees, and the Ramah paskins like Rashi and Tosos. The Ramah says, "V'yesh omrim davka mi shirago bahem kegon hamalachim she'omdim v'shochem l'chayshir or beis hamishta." And he says the problem is only if you're doing it too much, like you're like a kings who get up and go to sleep with music. That's already too much. Or in like a tavern in some kind of social drinking context, then it's a problem. And then he also adds, "V'chein l'tzorach mitzvah kegon beis chasen ukala kol shar." And everything's permitted for a chasen and kala. So at least for Ashkenazim, which many of us are, the Ashkenazim are much more broadly permissive when it comes to music, and would allow music in many more contexts, and only small limitations. However, I should say that despite what the Ramah says, and the fact that we ourselves are fairly lenient nowadays, and most people listen to music and don't really have very many restrictions on when they listen to music outside of, let's say, the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av or this period of Sfiras HaOmer. There are many poskim, even post Ramah, who are not so keen on listening to music so much. The Bach, for example, an important posek, is very strict, and he paskins actually like the Rambam's tshuva that even vocal music is forbidden. And Rav Moshe Feinstein, who I put here in source number 13, also is not very keen on music, much less so than you might expect a modern day posek to be. And he says, in the middle of the first line there, Avavade Maharoi, the Baal Nefesh Lahachmir, someone who is a Baal Nefesh, someone who is sort of very careful about halacha, he should be strict. Ki Rambam b'tshuvaso, according to the Rambam in his tshuva, the one that Rabach, Pasa Kavase, and then they're the ones that said that even vocal music is forbidden. Af shariyaso eno klum mikol makom lahachmir. Even though his proof is no good, rayaso, sorry, eno klum. Even though his proof is no good, mikol makom lahachmir. You should still be stringent. Uvzamar demana asu b'chol makom, and instrumental music is forbidden everywhere. Shkein sovar Rambam v'machaber, because that's what the Rambam says in Mishnah Torah. That's what the Shulchan Aruch says, the machaber. Okay, and then he says even also further on that tshuva, he says va'al yidei haradia. Im nishma zamra depuma mutter b'mechlei zemer aser. He says, even if you listen to the radio, it's okay if it's just a cappella, but if it's instrumental music on the radio, it's forbidden. So the Moshe Feinstein is extremely strict. Really, no one, I don't know anyone who follows Rav Moshe in this particular context. But it's just interesting to see how there is this very stringent streak going through the poskim all the way from the ancient sources down to the modern day. Why is this? Why do we sort of take a much more lenient approach? I'm not sure. I mean, it could be that music has changed a lot. I mean, when the Gemara is talking, the Gemara is, and the poskim are talking, they're talking, for example, about kings who get up and go to sleep with music. Now, if you think about it, especially when it comes to instrumental music, most people are not going to have access to instrumental music on a regular basis. I don't know how easy it was, for example, people to go to a concert. I don't know how common concerts were. A king, for sure, a king might have his own orchestra of a type, and then the king, yes, indeed, could get up and go to sleep with music. But for most people, music is something unusual. Music is something special. Music is not something that's every day. Nowadays, it's completely changed. Music is accessible with a push of a button, a command to your Alexa smart speaker, and it's just not as special and happy as it used to be. Music is simply just a lot more common. And I think maybe for that reason, we sort of just see music in a different way than some of the early post-game saw music and we're a lot more Mako. I don't really know. This is sort of my own tentative theory, but we do have to sort of contend with the fact, or just be appreciate the fact that when it comes to music in general, after the destruction of the base of English, there is this streak that is quite prohibitive and quite limiting in what we're allowed to do. Let me stop sharing the source sheet for just a minute and just address some of the comments in the chat before we move on to part two uh, of of what I'm going to present. Okay, let's see. Chat. Okay. Okay. David says, Shir Hashirim was certainly meant to be sung as its versions were written in song. Oh, interesting. I mean, I haven't looked at Shir Hashirim in that light, per se. Um, but sure, it's highly poetic, yes. And he also says it's interesting to note that the question with respect to the prohibition on music is brought into Mar Ukva and Bavel. One would have thought the prohibition would have originated in Eretz Yisrael, because yeah, that's where the base of English was destroyed. So one might have thought, indeed, that it should come from there and not in Bavel. And I don't know the answer to your question, but that's an interesting point. Ellen says, noting where the Rambam lived and the current view of the strict Salafi Muslims these days, so perhaps he didn't live in a musical society. That could be. It's another interesting point. Again, I don't know anything actually about that, and and uh, and what. But I mean, I can imagine that yes, that there's current Muslim views that are very strict about music, and I don't know what it was like in the Rambam's time though. Yeah, and so it could very well be also that when it comes to um, um, okay. Yeah, I mean the question is how do you fit in the part about the tavern and the wine? Is there a specific additional prohibition over there? David says the prohibition to refrain from singing in the tavern seems to be usher for a separate reason and not starting from the morning post destruction of the temple. Um, okay, I'd be curious to hear why you think it's necessarily separate. I could see it being separate. I could also at least Tosfos seems to think that they fit together though. But again, I guess you could read either ways. Either way, Shmuel says I disagree. The Rambam himself writes his medical books about music as a cure for the Sultan who was depressed. He also says how the power of music opens the mind and causes happiness, the kind of music that causes depression. So it seems that the Rambam at least was aware of music and had saw the value in it. So it's interesting how his halachic works. He says something very different. Could there be a difference between private and public groups when it comes to music? I don't know. I don't know if I saw that discussion in the post game or not, but I could see that. Um, Rav Reuven Feinstein once famously quipped that when his father says that a Baal Nefesh should refrain from a certain activity, Moshe referring to someone at very, very high level is far higher than him. Oh, interesting. So yeah, so it could be when the Rambam's when the Moshe is Baal Nefesh, he means a very high standard. Sometimes the Mishnah Brura, the Chavetz Chaim will also use the term Baal Nefesh, and then there's a lot of people who follow the Mishnah Brura. But it could be that when Rav Moshe says it, it means something very different. Thank you for that. Um, in days gone by, music would have been people singing. Sure, but there was, at various times as we're going to talk about, there was opportunities for instrumental music as well. I don't know how common it was, and depends on what time, though. Why is music treated differently from meat or wine? Recall the attempt to ban these after the destruction of the temple was unsuccessful. Yeah, there was definitely, Chazal definitely felt that like you had to draw a line somewhere. And there was discussion about that and how that didn't work because it was just too much. Um, right. So it does seem though that this prohibition at least stuck on the books, the prohibition against music, and it could be though also because music was just something that was like meat and wine you can't really do without. It's, in a way, like it's always there. It's ubiquitous. Music was something that was much more rare, I think, in those times. So it could be there was an easier prohibition to uphold. But again, I don't really know. It's my own speculation. Um, There was Susanna says there was music in the Rambam's time. There was a whole tradition of Arabic music. Yes, there is. Um, okay. Gemara Sanhedrin specifically bang sing shir shirim in taverns. Okay, that's interesting. Um, okay. Rav Herschel Schechter said that when the Mishnah Berurah uses Baal Nefesh, it meant people like the Rav and Rav Moshe. Okay, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think, yeah, that makes sense. Um, right. So lots of discussion here about this prohibition, and I'm not so much an expert in like how exactly this is applied nowadays in the contours of what all the poskim say. I just tried to give you a brief overview here of what some of the poskim say. I think on a very interesting topic because I do think it sets the stage for understanding uh, what's going on and to appreciate some of the later sources where we're going to see the sources do sometimes call back to these prohibitions in one way or another in discussing different types of music. But it does also seem that nowadays we are pretty lenient about music compared to what a lot of the post-game say. Um, I want to shift into the second part um, of this, and that is talking about where some of our music comes from. Because although, as we said, instrumental music largely went away with the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, vocal music in a way was just getting started. Because when it comes to shul, there is a huge vocal music component to what we do in shul. There is the reading of the Torah, according to the Ta'amim, according to the Trup, singing the Torah, and then also singing the Tefillah itself, the chants used for davening, or what we call the Nusach HaTefillah. And I'd like to try to discuss in the second part what we know about the origins of these two things. This is a very complex topic, as we're going to see, and we also don't know as much as we would like about either of these two things. The Torah, the Sefer Torah, as you know, doesn't have any any vowels or cantillation marks. It doesn't have nikudot. It doesn't have tamim. And in fact, we don't have written evidence of either of these two things, either vowels or tamim, until the Baalei Masorah in the years on the year 700 to 900. The Baalei Masorah was a group of people mostly centered in Tiberia and Tiberias called the Masoretes in English. One very important school is the Ben Asher school. And what they did is they took it upon themselves to compose codices, to compose books essentially of the Chumash and of the Tanakh, and they put in the vowels, they put in the Tamei HaMikra, they put in the Trup, and we do not have this before that. It does not seem to exist before that. There were earlier systems of both these things. There was like a what they call like a Palestinian system, a Babylonian system of Trup, which was different, we don't really use. The Tiberian system is the one that took over. We also see very interestingly, you may have noticed in a Tanakh, if you look at Eov, Mishle, and Tehillim, there is different Ta'amim. The Trup looks different. It's not the same as it is as it is in the rest of Tanakh. And it could be that was some scholars think that was like an earlier or rougher system of the Tamim before the full one developed. And we certainly don't have a tradition anymore of how to lane those Sfarim, although I believe the Yemenites still have some tradition of how to do that. Um, the most famous of these codices was the Aleppo Codex. Um, and the that's the one the Rambam actually cited as authoritative. Unfortunately, as many of you may know, the Aleppo Codex, parts of it were lost mysteriously. It was in Syria for many years. It seems like the Rambam even went to look at it. But in the early 20th century, the Aleppo Codex, part of the Aleppo Codex, was lost. The traditional story was it was destroyed in some kind of fire during a revolt there. Some have cast doubt on that story and say it seems more likely that it was taken by people and kind of hidden or distributed throughout the world by various unscrupulous collectors and has never really been recovered and lost. But anyway, the rest of the Aleppo Codex is currently in the Shrine of the Book in the Israel Museum with the Dead Sea Scrolls. But that's an important example of a Masoretic codex which has the Nikudot, it has the Ta'amim, and it has the Masorah on the side, which tells you like different places how to pronounce different words in different places and stuff like that. It's kind of a guide for how the Torah, as the Torah scrolls we said, doesn't have any of that. It's a guide for how the Torah scroll is supposed to be pronounced and chanted. Really, the Masoretes in the way are doing four different things. One is the vowels, and then the Ta'amim, the Trup, do three things. They show you where to accent the word. The trup, the tam will be under the part that you accent. It will divide up the words in the verse for syntax. When you have like the esnachta, that's where you stop in the middle of the pasuk there. It also tells you the way to chant it musically. Um, Nevertheless, although we don't see the tamim until the Baalei Masora or the Nekudos until the Baalei Masora come around, many people have surmised, and I think for good reason, that these things must have predated them, that they couldn't have invented this all on their own. That presumably there was some kind of oral tradition that they were preserving when they actually wrote it down in the year 700, 900, and that it wasn't completely made up by them. Um, what I want to do now is share with you a few sources that I thought were very interesting on this about a different view, which was this view that this view that actually the symbols themselves were actually transmitted at Har Sinai. So it seems to have been a common view among people that they were already handed down at Har Sinai, that both the Nekudos and the Tamim were handed down at Har Sinai. So in source number 14, we have over here Rabbi Eliyahu Bachor, who was a 16th century Italian grammarian and an interesting figure. He, among other things, he taught Hebrew grammar and mysticism to Christians. And in his work Masoret Masoret, he sought to disprove this view that these things come from Sinai. And he says, I've already explained at length. Ad shibiartu ve'varti shanakudas va'tamim lo nasdami Sinai. The vowels, the tamim, were not given at Sinai. V'gaman shikanes agadola lohim siyum klal. The men of the great assembly did not hand them. Ve'enim elamase de baalei masoros shkama achakach Moshe ba'arti. They were the work of the Masoretes that came later. And he says, why do I know this is true? And he says, I'll just read it. I'll just give you in the English here. His first proof is that they are not found anywhere in the words of the sages of the Talmud. In the Agada and the Midrash, there is no mention of a vowel or a tam ever. So, is it possible that they had in the Kudos and the Tami, but not ever once mentioned a kamatz or a patach or a segel or a tzere or a pashta, darga, tavir? Those are some of the trup. Pashta, darga, and tavir are three of the symbols for the trup. And he says, so how could it be if Chazal already had this and it wasn't created by the Baalei Masora that they never once mentioned one of these nikudos, one of these symbols? So it seems rather they were later. And he also says if they were given from Sinai, and you show that Moshe somehow knew them, so how come Moshe didn't write them down? Why didn't it go in the Sefer Torah? Or why didn't they have a Chumash already at that point that wasn't the Sefer Torah with the vowels and the trup in there? So he says or it was just lost. He says it's hard to believe. So he says basically he thinks there's very good evidence that the trup does not actually come from Har Sinai. The vowels do not come from Har Sinai, but were created later. The Machzer Vitri, a student of Rashi, quotes the Gaonim actually. So already early on, the Gaonim were right after the sages of the Talmud. The Gaonim is saying something very similar. And he says over there, Sha'altim, and you asked this question. He asked one of the Gaonim, possibly Rav, possibly I think it's possibly Rav Nachman Gaon, is asked him, Asr Lin Code Sefer Torah. Are you allowed to put vowels in the Sefer Torah? Sefer Torah shenot nitan Moshe b'Sinai lo shemana bo nikud. So the Sefer Torah given to Moshe at Har Sinai, there were no nikudos. V'lo nitei nikud b'Sinai ki chachamim tzaynuhu l'tziman. It's the sages who made these signs. V'asur lo lahosif mida'atenu. And therefore, that's why we can't put nikudos in the Torah, because they weren't there originally. Pen nav over Baal Tosif, or else you're gonna violate Baal Tosif of adding things that shouldn't be added. Lefikach ein noktin Sefer Torah. However, the Gaon says that, okay, yes, they weren't written down, but it does seem like we have some kind of old Sinaitic tradition of how to do the Tamim, how to lay in the Torah. So that's interesting. So it seems like the Gaonim are acknowledging that the Tamim were not written down by the sages, but that there is some kind of oral tradition of them. And indeed, this does make some kind of sense, because to say that the Masoretes just made it up without any kind of tradition of how the laning is supposed to sound seems unlikely. And also, the Gemara suggests in two places that there was some kind of tradition of how to lay in the Torah. The first one is here in source number 16. The Gemara is talking about some Pesukim in Sefer Nehemiah about Ezra reading the Torah publicly. And one of the things, the way the Gemara interprets this verse, is that one part of the verse it says Vayavinu b'mikra, that they understood the reading. They understood the reading of the Torah. Elu piske ta'amim, the Gemara says in the last line. These are the cantillation notes. So it seems like this idea of some kind of cantillation notes, some kind of musical tradition of how to lane, the Gemara is certainly already aware of it. The Gemara dates it back to Ezra, but at the very least, the Gemara is already aware there is some way of laning the Torah. And the Gemara is written, the Gemara is preserving traditions from the 300s, 400s. That's before the Balei Masorah in the 700s and 900s. So it seems at least back to the Gemara, there's some tradition of how to lane. We also see in source number 17 another Gemara, also very interestingly, the Gemara asks, why must one not wipe himself with his right hand but with his left? Rav Nachman Yitzchak Amar. The Gemara gives a lot of different answers, but one answer is from Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak. Because one points the cantillation notes of the Torah with his right hand. So what does the Gemara seem to be saying over here? What the Gemara seems to be saying, fascinatingly, is that there was a tradition of how to lane, but there were no written symbols for how to lane. They were hand signals for how to lane. And indeed, this is something called chironomy, the practice of using hand signals, and was already used in ancient Egypt for various things and adapted by the Byzantines later. And some of the tamim actually that we have for laning actually suggest that they were originally hand signals. For example, tipcha. Tipcha means hand breath. It seems like that was a way you were extending your hand. Pashta, another one, stretching. Seems, and again, a way you were extending your hand. Or shalsheles, which is a chain. So again, something you can do with your hands. Zakef, or from like Zakef Gaton or Zakef Gadol, also tamim that we have as part of the trup. That means upright. Again, these could all be hand motions. So it's at least plausible that before they were written down, they were at least hand motions for this. Okay. Now it's important to note also that the last point on tamim is that it's not musical notation. Because each one of these symbols is not a note, is not one pitch. It's a bunch of notes. It's really a mnemonic device. It's a way to remember a series of notes. For how they're chanted. So if you see the symbol for ma'apach or pashta, you know that like there's a series of notes that you do when you see that symbol. Now, how do we know though what those we have the symbols? Okay, we've discussed where the symbols come from. We discussed that maybe there was an oral tradition before, but how do we know what the symbols sounded like? How do we know they sounded the way they sound today? In fact, we know there are multiple different traditions of how to lane. There's the Yemenite, there's different Sephardi traditions, even the Yakis and the Eastern European Ashkenazim do the laning slightly different. It sounds slightly differently. So clearly there are multiple traditions, but there's also basic agreement where some of the notes sort of go down, some of them go up, some of them do different things, and we kind of have some basic consensus throughout the Jewish world on how that goes. And so the question is, where do they all come from? How do we know? What do we know? Do we know anything about when sort of how these sort of sounds developed, and do we have any documentation of what they sounded like a long time ago? And then relatedly, then we get to the question of nusach tefillah too. So we have certain ways that our davening sounds now. There's certain ways that our davening sounds. But where did that come from? How do we know? How do we know? And when did this really develop? So the answer is we can't really know because there's no sheet music. There's no ancient sheet music. There's no sheet music even from the Middle Ages that tells us how the davening went, how the laning went. The nusach hatfilah at least was not put down onto paper until the 19th century in Germany and then the United States. But let's talk for a minute about sheet music itself, and because I think that's an interesting topic, and also gets us to the earliest sheet music, the earliest sheet music we have of a Jewish song. So sheet music has its beginnings in the early 800s with the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne. He wanted to standardize religious chant across his empire, and this became Gregorian chant, which you've probably heard of. Gregorian chant does not actually have notes either in the modern sense. What it has is something called neumes, which means like note or sign in Greek. And it indicates where you should read up or down. Does the music go up? Do you go up or do you go down? And so it's like a general contour of a melody, but you don't have an exact pitch for what it's supposed to do. So in a sense, it's also kind of a memory aid like the trup. So this is kind of the earlier stage of music. Staff notation, where you actually have music written out in full with all the notes didn't come until the 11th century. It's credited to the Benedictine monk Guido of Arezzo. Now, this early music, the Gregorian chant, and then when staff notation is developed, it's mostly written by Christians. So, do we have any early written Jewish music? And the answer is yes. And I'll show you first on the source sheet, and then I'll hopefully play some of it for you also. Um, so you have here in source number 18, you have this interesting piece, which hopefully you can sort of see. I'm trying to make it even bigger, um, called Mi al Har Chorev. So this is the first written Jewish music that we have. So what is this Mi al Har Chorev? It seems to have been written by a man by the name of Ovadia Hager, who seems to have been a Norman nobleman, like a non-Jew originally, who converted to Judaism around the year 1102, and wrote down some musical notation for this Hebrew poem, beginning with the words Mi'al Har Charev. What is this poem? It seems to be about Moshe and Har Sinai. It was a piyut probably written for Shavuos or Simchas Torah to do during the davening, but we don't have it anymore, other than here. And this paper with the musical notation, with these neumes sort of on top of it, Gregorian chant styled musical notation, was found in the Cairo Geniza in 1918. And apparently, for a long time, no one really knew what it was. And then like someone just told me this recently. One day, like some scholar of Byzantine music was like walking by the office of someone studying the Geniza, and he saw these. I'm like, oh yeah, he's like, yeah, this is Gregorian chant. So we actually know how this is supposed to go. So this is now the earliest Jewish written music, and I want to play it for you. You can sort of hear the sound of what this early Jewish music sounded like. Hopefully, I'm not going to have too much trouble playing it. Give me a moment here. It should be able to do this. I had set this up. Um, let's see. I think I need to. All right, hold on. All right, I'm going to share. Yes, okay. So I'm going to share the window directly with the song, and I'm going to play it, and you can hear. If you, tell me if you can hear it. Can anyone hear this?
Yes, we hear it.
Oh, great. Okay. And hopefully you get a little sense of that. And I think someone already said in the comments, it sounds kind of Gregorian. Yeah, it sounds a lot like Gregorian chant. Um, so it sounds a lot like a Gregorian chant because that was the style it was. I mean, he was a Christian who converted, and it seems like he took the musical style with him. So there isn't really like kind of an authentic uh, Jewish musical tradition like that at the time. Although that does segue nicely into let's talk more about the Nusachat Tefillah in particular, because it does seem like there's a pretty long tradition of how the davening is supposed to sound. Um, I, like for example, there are there are certain chants that are associated with different philos. Um, and like if you hear, for example, like ah you know exactly where you are. You know you're in Mariv for Yom Noraim for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. If you hear Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu v'Elokei Avoseinu, you're in Avos, the first bracha of Chazaras Hashas Shemona Esrei for Shabbos and Yom Tov. Um, um, if one of the most sort of Jewish sounding of the modes of tefillah is something called fregish. It almost sounds like klezmer. We use this in our davening all the time. It's an interesting scale. It's like at the end of let's say you're like in many places, like in Chazaras Hashatz, let's say you're in Musaf on Shabbos and you're like Tikanta Shabbos Ratzisa Karvnoseo Sivisa Perashem da 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 da. You hear that like very, very Jewish sound there. Da 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 da. So it's very unique to our davening, in the Ashkenazi tradition, and all of these sort of modes are seem very well established and very unique. The question is where exactly did they come from? Um, where exactly did they come from? So we don't really know. But there's good reason to assume that there is a body, at least, of these musical modes that dates back to the Middle Ages. And I'll explain sort of some little hints we have that at least between the 12th and 16th century, there seems to have been standardized tunes for the davening that developed. Let me share my source sheet again. Hold on. I think I have to go back to my window and switch it. Okay, here we go. Now I think we should be able to share it again. Okay, it's a little smaller again. Okay. So if you look here in source number 19, Rabbi Yehuda HaChasid, from the Sefer Chasidim, he writes something interesting. And he says, Lo tasti gvul asher gavlu rishonim shetiknu, which one must not move the boundaries that the early authorities have established. V'hanigum shelo yomar nigun v'hanigunim, with regard to tunes, shelo yomar nigun shel Torah l'neviim, uksuvim, shel neviim l'Torah ksuvim. Don't switch the tunes of the Torah for the prophets and the writings and vice versa. Um, Every tune has to be as it's used. Shakol halacha lemoshe b'Sinai, because everything is halacha lemoshe b'Sinai. Everything comes from Sinai. Shnemer v'yanenu b'kol, because it says Hashem answered Moshe with a voice. Over there, he brings a proof from a pasuk. Anyway, so you see a few really interesting things from this piece from Yehuda Chassid. It seems like in his time, in 13th century Germany, there were established tunes for the laning, some for Torah and some for Nevi'im, some for Haftorah, that are different. And he says, don't change it. And the reason he says not to change it is this is halacha l'Moshe miSinai. Now, does he actually mean that like this is there's a tradition all the way from Sinai of these things? Maybe not. He might just mean that it's old. Sometimes when people use those language, they mean that something that's ancient is something that's well established. It's actually very interesting. This piece from Yehuda Chassid, though, of calling it Halach L'Moshe Misinai, in more modern parlance, develop into something called Misinai tunes. Misinai tunes. Maybe you've heard this phraseology before, that our davening has these Misinai tunes. Particularly when it comes to Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there are certain things that people will say. Chazanim will tell you, like when I was in the Bell School in YU, they would say, "Oh, you can't change this. This is Misinai Nosach. This is Misinai Nosach. This piece can't be changed." It's interesting. No one before the 20th century really used that terminology of Misinai Nosach. It seems to be something that was mostly due to musicologists in the 20th century, possibly a little bit earlier in the 19th century. But it does also seem to come from this piece of Yehuda Chassid. They're applying his language, where he says that this halacha l'Moshe miSinai. But in any event, it seems that at least for Yehuda Chassid's time, there was an established body of which tunes go with laning, different lanings. If you look at the Raman source number 20, he's quoting here from the Maharil. The Maharil is a very important chazan and purveyor of Ashkenazi minhag in 14th century Germany. And he writes, Va'al yeshana adam mimina ga'ir, afilu binigum o piyutim sh'omrim sham. You cannot deviate from the custom of the city, even with regard to the tunes or piyutim that are says there. So it sounds like already when it comes the Maharil's time in the 14th century, there are established sets of tunes that are used for the davening. It doesn't say what they are, but it seems like there was an established body of them. The Maharil's student, Rav Zalman of St. Gor, wrote down his practices in the Sefer Maharil. There are no tunes recorded in Sefer Maharil either. But what you do have in Sefer Maharil is a very detailed explanation of what we should say when. On Shabbos, on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, and how certain words should be said. So, for example, in source number 21, it says, I'll just read in the English, on Rosh Hashanah the Chazan starts from Hamelech HaYosef. right? So we know this, that the Chazan gets up and it goes, ha, and goes to Hamelach, instead of starting in the usual place. And the Maharil said to start quietly and get progressively louder so that it can be heard with fear and awe, which is something we do today too. So it seems already in the 14th century, it was pretty well established of a way of how to chant the davening. Again, it doesn't tell you the tune, but it does seem that if already they were starting quieter and getting louder like we do today, that probably the tunes at least date back to at least the 14th century, if not older. Um, there's also actually an interesting, tantalizing hint, sort of, that our tunes are pretty old. But again, it's also interesting because it shows us how much cross-cultural influence there is between Jewish and non-Jewish music. So this is something I read in a very fascinating article about the Zemer we sing on Friday night, Kol Makadesh. Perhaps you've heard Kol Makadesh. So apparently there's a traditional Eastern European tune for Kol Makadesh, which I didn't really know, but maybe some of you have heard this, and it goes something like this: Kol Mekadesh Shvi'i Kara Oilo Kol Shomer Shabbos Kadas Mechalelo Secharo Harbe Morav Hifalo Ishal Machnehu Vishal Diglo. Anyone heard this before? No, okay. If you go to like the National Library in Israel, they have like a.
We use that tune all the
Well, you do
time.
use that tune. Okay, there you go. All right. Yes, this is a traditional Eastern European tune for Kol Makadish. Now, what does it sound like? Also, like, what does it sound really, really similar to?
Something in Rosh Hashanah davening.
It's actually not Rosh Hashanah davening; it's just regular Shabbos davening.
Oh, okay.
It's regular Shabbos davening. I'll tell you. So we go like, the Chazan starts for Shachris, like Shochein Ahad Marvam V'Kadosh Shemo, and then he goes Bifi Yishrim Tisala Uvnivrei Tzadikim Tisbarach Uvashon Chasidim Tisramam Uvekerev Kedoshim Tiskadash. It's almost identical to that Kol Makadesh tune. So they seem to share some common core. So here's where it gets a little unusual, though. So if you look in if you look in the last source over here, wait, am I not sharing this? Let me reshare the source sheet because I put it down for some reason. Okay, if you look in the last source over here, source number 22. This is Sefer Yosef Ometz. He's a collector of minhag in the early 18th century Germany, and he says. Ein la'asos nigunim belel Shabbos v'motzei Shabbos b'nigune zimrei hanachim. Do not make tunes for Friday night or Motzei Shabbos with the non-Jewish tunes. Kimo Kol Makadesh, like Kol Makadesh. So what does it sound like? It sounds like people were singing. People were singing Kol Makadesh to a non-Jewish tune. And now what's fascinating is we have documented actually sheet music from that time period. There's some Lutheran hymn called Bruderweit, and this Lutheran hymn sounds suspiciously similar to the Kol Makadesh that I sang for you, and also to the Nusach for Shochein Ad Fi Yisharim that I sang for you from Shachars. So it seems there is some common core to all three of those things. What way did the influence go? I don't know. I don't know that we can say for sure, but it does seem that I guess we see a couple things from here. I guess we see number one that there is a lot of cross-cultural influence between Jewish and non-Jewish tunes. But we also see, and maybe this is actually very comforting in a way, that our nusach for davening is pretty old. Like we're talking like 1500 or something like that, at least, if not older. So like, and the fact of the matter is, I don't know the Lutherans are still singing that song, but we're still using the nusach for davening. So it's really become very Jewish in a way. I mean, you can say the same thing, for example, about the tune for, maybe we'll talk about this later, actually, but the tune for Ma'od Tzor. Ma'od Tzor Yeshuasi, very well documented. This is a Lutheran hymn. This tune is a Lutheran hymn. But the Lutherans aren't singing anymore, and we're still singing it. So regardless of sort of where exactly to situate the Nusach Tefillah in terms of the influence they might have picked up from the surrounding culture, it's still very old. We're talking about hundreds of years old at the very least. One thing I did not address in this class, and I'm not going to be able to address because I don't know enough about it, I'm also running out of time, is the Sephardic Nusach HaTefillah, which is completely different, as any of you who have been to a Sephardic shul will realize. Um, the way they do it, I believe, is based on something called a makam. A makam is an Arabic term. It's an Arabic style of music where certain notes or scales are put together and grouped, kind of like our own nusach, like the kind of like the Ashkenazic nusach hatfila, also, where there's certain groups of notes that go together. But in the Sephardic one, they have a different sort of set of scales or notes that are grouped together, and each makam takes has a different character to it, and each Shabbos on the calendar is assigned to a different makam. And there's some overlap also between different Shabboses or different types of events and different types of things. But basically, while we, for example, might have, every time you get up on Shabbos for Shacharis, it's going to sound the same, and Musaf is going to sound like Musaf, and theirs is much more dependent on the time of year and the parsha, and it depends on which makam you do it in. And those makams also, I should just say, are very clearly borrowed from Arabic chant in whatever time period it was, the Middle Ages, or whatever. So like they're not authentically Jewish in that way either, but the fact of the matter is that those are used there too. So we see really there really is this tremendous overlap between Jewish and non-Jewish styles when it comes to music. So yeah, that's a lot, and I hope that I kind of tried to cover a lot of topics here all at once. So we'll hopefully set up some of the things we're going to talk about later. In the next class, we're going to focus on the different roles of the chazan. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you here again next week. The time is up. You're free to leave. I will look more at the chat now and address some further comments there. And if people, after I do that, if people want to ask questions, I'm happy to entertain those as well.
Are you going to explain the word nusach itself, the origin of the word nusach?
Fred, you wanted to go through the chat first.
Yeah, sorry. Gershon, I'll go right back to you. Okay, let me go through the chat. Okay. Given the early Christians were Jews, their music would have been that of the Jews and thus preserved by the church, though it could be very changed over time. Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard to know what was going on in the first century in Israel. It was in vogue a long time ago, like 100 years ago. There was particularly a very famous musicologist, Jewish musicologist, by the name of Avram Tzvi Idelson. I don't know if any of you have heard of him or not, but he was very important. He kind of wrote the book on Jewish music. And Idelson's contention, to the extent I understand it, is that if you go back already to the first century Eretz Yisrael, and you look at the music there, and you look at the music among the different groups, including the early Christians, you can discern a specific way that the music sounds, a certain series of notes, a certain way that it comes together. And he says, well, that's the core of what Jewish music is. And that core has continued throughout time. But in recent times, people have said that doesn't really work. Like you can't really, it's kind of a stretch to say there really is this consistent core that runs through all of Jewish music throughout all of history. Okay. Esther says, isn't it possible the music of the Levites influenced Gregorian chant? Such theories have been proposed. Yeah, I mean, sure. I mean, it's just the problem is I think we just don't know what the music of the Levium really sounded like. So it's hard to know if it influenced Gregorian chant or not. It definitely seems that at some point music is very old, and presumably every time music is somewhere, and then someone else starts doing music, presumably they're borrowing from what the prior music was. So there's going to be some kind of core, that goes through, but it's hard to know like what part of what goes with what. And I'm also not musically adept enough really to identify that. But as I said, it also seems like modern day scholars are not so keen on this idea that we can trace a particular Jewish streak throughout all music over the centuries. Ellen says, don't we associate Sinai tunes with the Maharil? Yes, Ellen, thank you so much for saying that. We do. But but it's wrong, and let me explain why. I kind of was running out of time there, but I'm glad I'm happy to go through it now. So, the Maharil nowhere in his writing says anything about Sinai tunes. Nowhere. Now I'm not expert enough to have read everything the Maharil ever wrote. But I have read the articles of the people who have gone through the Maharil, and this is what they said. The Maharil never uses the term Sinai tune. The term Sinai, to the extent it's used at all, is used by Rav Yehuda HaChassid in that source that we saw, where Rav Yehuda HaChassid says it applies to not changing the tune for the Torah reading, like switching the Haftorah and the Torah tune, for example. So that's where it's used. It's not used in the context of the Nusach HaTefillah, but used in the context of the Torah reading. Now that is similar. And it seems like from Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid, that term then got applied to tefillah, but it's not in the Maharil. Now, the term Misinai Nusach seems to have been popularized by the same musicologist I mentioned a couple minutes ago, Idelson. Idelson is the one who talks about in his book about how there are Misinai tunes. And he mentions something, I don't know if he mentions something about the Maharil, I think in the same sentence. It's kind of a little vague. I think I remember looking at this, and it's not exactly clear what he means. So it's possibly that from Idelson already we start to get this idea that the Maharil actually said something about Misinai tunes, even though the Maharil didn't. There's a really fascinating article on this topic, what actually says that Idelson, though, is not the first one to apply Misinai tunes to the Nusach HaTfilah, and that actually the first person to do this in writing is Naftali Hertz Imber in the 19th century, who many of you may know was the author of Hatikva. He wrote a number of different unusual works, apparently, not just musical stuff, and he used the term Misinai Nusach also to refer to the chants for the davening. Did he make it up then? Not clear. It could be that this was an oral tradition that goes back further, but no, the Maharil does not say it. I think in the Orthodox community today, the reason why we associate the Maharil with the term Misinai is because of a particular chazan who taught at the Bell School of Music by the name of Sherwood Goffin, who passed away a few years ago, who was a really great scholar of liturgy, and also one who really went around to shuls talking about the importance of not changing the Nusach HaTfilah, and I really applaud the work that he did. He had a couple articles online, a couple shirim where he talks about the Maharil, saying Misinai tunes, but the Maharil did not see it. So unfortunately, Cantor Goffin is wrong, even though I very much think that what he was doing was very good. So that's a long answer to your short question. Shmuel says, here's a link to a 300-page book written on ancient Jewish tunes and Talmud Mikra with music notes from koshermusic.org, which is a site that I have seen. I'll have to take a look at that later. Thank you. Oh, sorry. I skipped the first 20 chats. Let me see.
No, you didn't. Those are the
Oh.
ones you did earlier when you
Yeah,
stopped.
okay, yeah. So I think maybe you weren't there, but I did talk about those about halfway through the class. Okay, I'm happy to open the floor to questions now if anyone has any further questions. I think so. Was it Garish? Someone
He wanted to know nusach, what the origin of the
Nusach.
word nusach is.
Right. So I don't know. I don't know the origin of the word nusach. I will say that we often use it in two different ways. One is nusach can be. Sorry, I'm blanking on this for a second. But the nusach is the way something is written, or the way, or you know, like what the nusach is right in the siddur, right? So right in the siddur, so the nusach could be, you know, this is the words that you're supposed to say. Like we use, for example, this word, while the Sephardim have a different nusach, and they say a different word over here. So that's one meaning of the word nusach. And the other meaning of the word nusach is the one we're talking about here, which is a certain way of chanting the davening. I don't know that it really has a great translation in this context. But I think we can very basically say that when we talk about nusach hatfilah in terms of the chant, we're talking about a series of notes or a mode that's grouped together. Like we talked about when we talked about the fregish. The fregish has that certain sound to it at the end, like da 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 da, which is very identifiable. And so that is another way to use the word nusach. But no, I don't know what the origin of the word is.
Okay, Susanna, you had the question.
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yeah.
Jema says yeah. I heard this from Joshua Jacobson, who's the founding director of the Zamir Chorale of
Yeah.
Boston.
Mm-hmm.
Many years ago, they had a Shabbaton, and to get ready for some concert. So Shabbos morning, they're going to have davening, and so they're getting together, and they want to know. It's like, are there any Kohanim here? And some hands went up. Then they asked, are there any Levium here? And a whole mess of hands went up. So it seems like, it's there's something to Levim and music.
Yeah, maybe that's interesting. Yeah, I will say about Joshua Jacobson, I've encountered him a little bit online. He's done some really interesting work preserving a lot of the choral music, um, of starting in the Renaissance and also going through later times, the Jewish music of the Chazanim as well. And I think I'm going to play a recording in the third class from the Zamir Chorale of something, because I think it'll be very illustrative of what we're talking about.
Okay.
Hi. One,
By
o-
the way,
one other thing, Yosef, you had said that with the Sfardim, very often different Shabbatot will have different tunes, whatever. The same thing is true, by the way, of the Yekish congregations also. They have a lot of different things devoted to different specific Shabbatot during the year, changes in the different tunes that are used.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I didn't know that about the Yemenites, but that makes sense. Yeah.
Not Yemenites, the Yekis.
Oh, the Yekis. Oh, sorry. Well, yes, but I think like still for the Yekis, they do have specific. I mean, I, I used to go to Breuer sometimes. I'm not an expert. I'm sure you know a lot more than I do, but I mean, I think more over there, it's like more changes in like specific parts. They'll be like, okay, we're gonna do this. We do this tune on this Shabbos and stuff like that, as opposed to like in general among Ashkenazim and Yekis too, though, like the basic sort of chant for what Mariv on a Shabbos sounds like stays the same, unless it's like Yom Tov or something, or Rosh Hashanah or something like
Yeah,
that.
but they'll have a special Kaddish here and a special, you know, different
Right.
things will have very specific tunes that they use regularly.
Right. Yes. Right. I understand what you're saying. Yes. I think it's still, I mean, I'm having a hard time explaining, but I think it's still different than what the Sephardim do, where it's not just so much from like a different tune, but it's sort of in a whole different mode. Like, like the Yekis might like for this Kaddish, they'll do it to a special tune on that part of the year, but the rest of Mariv will still be in the regular Mariv tune, while the Sephardim, I think the whole thing will be in like a different mode. I think.
I know in the 3 weeks, some of the shuls have, I think they have like a different tune. We just do on Shabbos Nachamu, like for Eli Tzion, but I think the classical nusach was they had different tunes for each one of the 3 weeks and whatever.
You,
But
you mentioned you meant Shabbos Chazon, not Shabbos Nachamu.
I meant Shabbos Chazon. Thank you very much. Good. Okay. Who wants to think about Tisha B'Av? So, right. Okay. Thank you. All right. And I will say, we sing Kol Kaddish. That's the one Zemer that we sing every week, whatever family tradition, but not that tune. We have a Hasidic tune, I
Oh,
believe, that comes
interesting.
from Eastern Europe, but Kol Kaddish Shivi, Kavru Eloi, Kol Shomer Shabbat, Kadat Mechalalo. You have to hear it a few times to know what it
Okay.
is.
Okay.
Anyways, but so it was very interesting to hear about this other Koma Kaddish that I didn't know existed. But anyway,
I only learned it from this research, but apparently it was very widespread in Eastern Europe.
uh-huh.
Yosef,
Yeah.
it's quite well known that many of the melodies that we use are from other sources, and in fact,
Sure.
many of them are from Christian sources.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, and
and
we'll
we
we'll talk more
continue
about that as the series goes on, but yes.
we continue that tradition now. I don't know if you ever heard Dror Yikra sung
Mm-hmm.
to "Come on the Sloop, John B." or something like
Yeah.
that, right?
The
Draw
Scarborough
ye
Fair. They used to
cloud
sing
the
it to Scarborough Fair.
The
Roar ye
Scarborough
day.
cloud.
Fair.
Roar ye
Yeah,
cloud the
I'm not
day.
I'm not a particularly big fan of doing that because there's so many beautiful melodies that we don't have to do that. But nonetheless, yeah.
Well, yeah.
So we continue to steal that music, and in fact, it's well known that many of the Chazanim would go visit the churches to get inspiration.
Yeah. We'll talk about that. That's actually comes from a very interesting tshuva. That we'll talk about in the third class.
Yeah,
Um.
but I was the one to write that bit about why music was allowed to be banned after the destruction of the temple, and but meat and wine were not. Right? The,
Mhm.
the rabbi had a perfectly good answer for why we shouldn't ban meat and we shouldn't ban wine. It's right in the Talmud. Is his response to all of that? Right? I mean, there was this effort, and there's this. Um, uh,
Remind me, was that because it was just too difficult? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, he says,
Yeah.
are we going to not do this? Are we not going to have any? They wanted to ban meat, and then well, what about bread? And he kept pushing the envelope. He says, if you're going to start, why would you do that, right? So then why music? Why would somehow you know? But it's not unusual that people do respond that way. I mean I know of a cousin who had suffered a personal loss when he was a kid, and his father banned music in the household. He,
Interesting.
he grew up, and now
Interesting.
he's a chazan and sings and so forth. But he grew up without music because apparently one of his siblings died, and his father
Huh.
banned music. You see, so yeah.
I mean, music definitely does bring joy. And I think there is like obviously this idea after the structures of Beis Hamikdash to limit our joy, but the question is to what extent? And I do think maybe it was easier for the ban on music to stick rather than meat and wine because it was less prevalent at the time, especially instrumental music. I don't know how much Jews were doing that. Um, at the time. But it's also interesting just to go back to Dror Yikra for a second. So yeah, I hear you that that's a particular modern borrowing of a tune. Like we're talking like within many people's lifetimes. But this has been going on like throughout Jewish history and throughout the history of these tunes. So you go back just 100 years before that, and like for example, the tune we use for Kiyash Mara Shabbat, Kiyash Mara Shabbat, Kel
Yeah.
Yishmereni. That's some kind of Ottoman military march, apparently.
Mhm.
And this is documented as well. So
Yeah.
like it's like maybe the Droya Guerrero one makes us more uncomfortable because it's within in some people's lifetimes, but
That's exactly right. And some of the other traditional melodies that we have are the Russian drinking songs.
right,
You
yeah.
know,
And you
yeah.
have that too. And the Hasidim were very big into like, like it doesn't really matter what the source of the melody is, but you can take it and you can be Makadesh it and you can make it holy through the way that you use it. And hopefully we'll talk a little more about these issues as we go on through this series. This is definitely a recurring question that's going to come up again and again is about this non-Jewish influence.
Joseph, I can't let you leave. I have to tell the story. I
Okay, sure.
when I was in yeshiva at Hakotel many moons ago on Purim. So all the the chutznikim. It was in days when not everybody went to yeshiva in Israel. We're sitting in the back, and there was no internet. None of that stuff. We spoke home once a month. So it was Purim time. So Rav Hadari and the yeshiva called, wanted us to sing. The American kids, whatever, should sing. So we started going on Purim. Ay, 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 ay. Ay, 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 ay. And Rabbi Dar came and he started clapping. He was so happy to hear us sing with such kavana that song. And it's, you can't get away with that today, but it just shows you, it was a different world.
What
That's
song
over
is
40 years
that?
ago.
What
You know.
song is that?
Ay, 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 ay. If you don't know that song, you're not living in America.
It's Jingle Bells.
Oh,
Jingle bells, jingle
Well,
bells.
wait. I should have. I
I was a good yeshiva boy. I was a
Okay,
good.
I'll have to say this in my next class. So about my recent fame with my article, my Jewish Action article.
I'm sorry.
Oh, so all right, I'll have to say this in the next class. But
Okay, that's
yeah,
late. We should let people
yeah,
go. It is late.
yeah.
Thank you for
I have a good
staying.
story though
Thanks,
about Christmas tunes. It's a good story about Christmas tunes.
yeah, it's good. Okay, we have to wait till everybody comes back for that
Yeah.
one. Okay. All right, everybody. Rabbi Helfgott tonight on Sefer Yecheskel, 8:30 is ongoing series. Welcome. And next week we'll have actually 3 new series starting, if I believe, at least 3. Ari Schwad is going to be starting on Rav Kook, a series on Rav Kook. He runs the archives of Rav Kook. He's really one of the world's experts on Rav Kook. Mark Shapiro's recently book, where he spoke about his book, he thanks him at the beginning, or one of the sources, the expert on Rav Kook. He'll be starting 6-part series Monday at 11. Mark Shapiro will be rejoining his great rabbinic series, Thinkers, and Rav Shimon Shkop is going to be starting this Monday night. And Shuli Mishkin will be beginning her new series next week on others, Baha'i and Christians, all the people living in Israel. Maybe it ties in all the influences we have. So that'll be next Thursday at 12, plus all our regular classes. Of course, please God, will be going on. So lots to keep you busy. Please invite a friend to come, and we look forward to learning with you. And our pleasure. And thank you, Rabbi Yosef, and please God, we'll see you next week. All the best, everybody.
Is there something tomorrow at 12 or not?
No, tomorrow at 12 not. Last week we had the special class last week by Mark Trencher. No, tomorrow, no, Shuli's going to start next week at 12. Tomorrow is just Parshat HaShavua. Via Ezra, we're going to have someone who has yet to speak for Torah Motion is going to be speaking tomorrow night. She's teaching here in Toronto from Israel, but her English is very good. She grew up in Boston, but anyway, so that'll be tomorrow night, 8:30 at Parshat. And then my shir, of course, 9:25 Friday morning on the Siddur. Okay, not Nusach, the Nusach HaSiddur, not the Nusach HaSiddur. Okay, as you know what I mean. Okay, everybody. Be well, and we look forward to seeing you soon. All the best.
Yosef, thank you very much. Very nice share.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye-bye.